Hello, everyone, and welcome back to American Ultras Talk. It's been about a week since the USMNT lost 2-1 to Mexico in the Gold Cup final, ultimately taking a summer that could have had so much potential and so many opportunities for growth for the USMNT, and ending it in a big disappointment, to say the least. Now, since it's been a week, I've had time to look back at what's happened in the summer, all of the games, all of the individual performances, everything going on behind the scenes as well. And I thought it was the perfect time to put together a list of the top 5 takeaways I have for the USMNT from the Gold Cup. Basically, all this summer as well, but mainly the Gold Cup because that's the majority of the games we had. Now, unfortunately, Yuri, as you may have been able to notice from the videos recently, has been extremely busy with all of the things in his personal life, work, etc. And he wishes he was in these videos. We just thought it would be better for the channel to keep uploading, even if it's solo videos, just because we've already seen in the past, especially towards the end of last season, we went a long time without uploading because of similar circumstances, and we ultimately just think it's better to keep producing content, whether the circumstances are ideal or not. So with that out of the way, let's get into the first big takeaway I have from this summer. And we're going to start out with what honestly is the only positive one I have. And again, feel free if you disagree with me or if you have any other takeaways that I don't mention or don't touch on in this video, please let me know in the comments. We're more than happy to interact with every single one of you. We love hearing your guys' input and getting to have conversations in the comments over agreements, disagreements. It's just really fun interacting with you guys. So if there's anything that we don't touch on in this video, please let us know in the comments, and we're more than happy to discuss that. But the first takeaway I have is that the one that I actually thought leading into the summer, and if you go back and watch some of the videos before the games, you'll see that I mentioned this, is that Chris Richards and Malik Tillman are both locked-in starters for the USMNT. Now, coming into this summer, I thought there was 3 players, maybe 4, but mainly 3, that we really needed to see a big summer out of. Chris Richards and Malik Tillman were 2 of them. The other was Johnny Cardoso. You can also kind of put Mark McKenzie in that situation as well. I think all 4 of them, but for the most part, the 3 main ones, Johnny, Malik, and Chris, absolutely needed to have their best performances in the USMNT shirt, and for the case of Malik and Johnny, really finally break out. Chris Richards has been pretty inconsistent before the summer. For the national team, he had that one really good game in the final against Canada a couple years ago, but other than that, it's been very inconsistent. Some good games, some bad against poor opposition. And then, of course, Malik and Johnny hadn't really shown much of anything, to the point where there was questions from the fan base of whether they even care about representing the national team. And I think it's very fair to say, at least for Richards and for Tillman, that it has been proven they care, and they are finally reaching the level that we've seen them hit for their clubs, Crystal Palace, PSV, with the national team. And it's huge, honestly, because I think outside of probably goalkeeper, center back is the #1 question spot for the USMNT, especially heading into the World Cup. I mean, the partner of Chris Richards is Tim Ream, who is 37 years old. I believe he'll be 38 for the World Cup. That's not exactly ideal, especially when, I mean, it'd be one thing if it was a Pepe situation that Portugal had for the Euros last year, where he was very old but still performing at a high level. Tim Ream is now struggling in MLS and struggling for the national team. And on top of that, he's old and seems to be declining every single game. So not an ideal situation. Again, Richards had been a question mark. Now he's finally a locked-in starter. I'd say he was probably the best player for the USMNT this summer. Which is huge, honestly, because if we had 2 question marks at center back, it would have been an absolute disaster going up against top quality attacks. And we saw that against Switzerland when Richards wasn't in the lineup. And it's just huge. I think that we have him fully locked in and at his best for the national team, because that is one of the most important positions on the pitch, and it's one that we've been lacking in. Now, for Malik, one of the things that I mentioned, and it was the main concern for him and for Johnny as well, unfortunately, Johnny didn't get to prove that he cared, really, because he played in the friendlies. He was really bad against Turkey. He was directly responsible for the goal that Arda Güler scored, kind of. I mean, it we didn't really know much about the goal, but technically it'll count as his. And then he got injured. He had the flu, which caused him to miss a few games. He had a recurring ankle injury that caused him to miss the rest. So we ultimately just didn't see enough out of Johnny this summer, so that there's still huge question marks for him. The opposite can be said about Malik Tillman. He's been so good in the Gold Cup, almost single-handedly at times carrying us. I mean, if you look at the attack that we had against Mexico, he was really the only one who was even getting the ball in the attacking half for us and trying to create something. He was all by himself. And I think another key thing that really shows that he does care is his work on the defensive side of the ball that we saw this summer. I think at times for the national team, he kind of appeared nonchalant. It seems like he didn't really provide much value off ball, or when we didn't have the ball, or when the other team had the ball, defensive wise. But this tournament, he looked really engaged defensively. And I think he actually ended up leading the team in a few defensive stats. As an attacking midfielder, that's pretty impressive. And it just shows the commitment that he has. To me, I think it's without a doubt that he is, at least for now, a locked-in starter for the USMNT going forward, and probably will be for the World Cup as well. We'll have to see what Gio Reyna does, because that spot was his before Tillman stepped in and took it. There's also Luna in the equation, but he's been playing as more of a winger, and I still have doubts on his level against real competent opponents. But I think for now, the big positive we can take away from this summer is Chris Richards and Malik Tillman. They're finally at their best for the national team. And again, like I said, that was the most important thing we could have taken away from the summer, player personnel-wise, and we got it. So I'm very happy with that. Now, moving on to my second point, and it's going to be shifting from the players to the manager, and it's going to be talking about Poch. Now, my main complaint with Poch, and I do think if you were going to say an overall winner or loser from this camp, I think Pochettino would probably be the biggest loser. I think there's one main problem with him, and it's that he either doesn't know the player pool well, or he doesn't care enough about the job to properly analyze it. And it could be a little bit of both. But if it's one or the other, I honestly don't know which one is worse. Sorry, let me know in the comments, again, which one you think would be worse, him either not knowing enough or not caring enough. I think each one provides a lot of problems, and I think there's a very reasonable case to be made that both of them could even be true. And if you look at what he did with the roster, he decided to drop a bunch of huge names, maybe not huge names, but a lot of established first-team players who maybe aren't starters necessarily, but are guys who have proven themselves that they can come in and do a job, whether it's off the bench or starting in certain situations because of injuries, like Scally replacing Dest, or Testman replacing Johnny or Adams when they were both injured. So I don't understand the decision from him to, again, this is the point of not knowing the player pool. He invited the wrong players to camp. Paxton Aronson, who had one of the best seasons in the Eredivisie of any player of any nationality, didn't even get the call-up initially. It took an injury to Sean Zawadzki from the Columbus Crew for Paxton to get called up, which is just utterly ridiculous. Nathaniel Brown still has not even been contacted. Now, maybe we contact him and he says, my focus is Germany. That's fine. At least you made an effort. We're not making an effort for Nathaniel Brown or for any other dual nationals because Poch either doesn't know them, and that falls on the Federation and the scouts, or he doesn't care enough. And again, that's a huge problem because I think it's evident based on the play of the left backs that we saw this summer that Nathaniel Brown would be a huge addition to this team, especially if in a nightmare scenario, Anthony Robinson gets hurt. Then suddenly we're basically without a left back for the World Cup. Nathaniel Brown would fix that very glaring hole in the team. Another thing that I have to complain about Poch, and this is kind of 2A in the top 5 list, is that his in-game management is an absolute disaster. And adding on to that as well, maybe that's part 2B, his general management of the squad in tournament play. This was the last and really only actual tournament that the USMNT would play before the World Cup next summer. We had an extended period of time with the squad, and there was a lot of games with not a lot of turnaround. We had games every few days. Normally, in a tournament situation, this is why it's so important that every single player in the squad is good enough to do a job when they get on the pitch. Because in a situation where players are too tired, they need a rest, maybe someone has a slight injury because they've been playing too much, someone has to come in and be able to do as decent of a job as necessary. And we didn't see that from this summer. I think that everyone can agree that our main goal from this summer was, since we didn't have a lot of the A team, whether it's by Poch's decision or by their own decisions, and we'll get to that a little later in the video. Since we didn't have the A team, this B/C team that came in, the entire purpose of this summer should have been to test everybody out and see who's good enough to fight for a World Cup roster spot, who's good enough to play a role off the bench when everyone is healthy, when everyone is back in the World Cup next summer. If something goes wrong with one of the players, or if someone needs a rest, someone needs a sub, their legs are tired, they can't carry on, who can come in off the bench and make an impact? That was the entire objective of this summer, to figure that out. Did we figure that out? Absolutely not, because for one, some of the wrong players were brought, like I mentioned. For two, Poch in game and for all of the lineups in general didn't rotate the squad at all. We saw the exact same starting lineup trotted out for 3 consecutive knockout games, and as a result of that, our players looked absolutely dead against Mexico. They dominated us the entire game after Richard scored the early header. We never looked like we even had a chance to get back into the match. It looked like we were losing, even though we were 1-0 up for a short period of time. It was inevitable for them to get the first goal. It was inevitable for them to get a second goal. And I think we're lucky it wasn't even more than 2-1, to be honest, because having the early goal kind of saved us, because Mexico had to come back, and then when they were already up, they had to defend their lead. So it's just not an ideal situation when all of your players that you've been relying on are tired and can't carry on. And another reason why they were so tired is because Poch didn't make any subs. I mean, he did, but he made them in the 80th minute or even later when they didn't have an impact. He was so late to react to what was going on in the games, and it almost cost us. And even when he did make subs, they were the wrong ones. I remember against Guatemala, he brought off Tyler Adams when we had a lead, and as a result of that, now we have no CDM. You're bringing on Jack McGlynn for him, who his one weakness is his lack of defensive ability. Guatemala then score. It's now 2-1. It was a cagey rest of the match for the last 5-10 minutes. And it really never should have got to that point, but it did because Poch made the wrong subs and he made them too late. All of our players clearly got tired early on in matches as a result of these lack of rotation in the starting lineup, and they weren't subbed off because Poch just couldn't be bothered to make any changes, whether that's him being stubborn or that's him simply just not caring enough to make the changes. I don't know personally, but either one is a big problem, because in a tournament like the World Cup, where there's now going to be 48 teams, there's now going to be even more matches than there were before, using the entirety of the squad is absolutely imperative to success. And from what we saw this summer, Poch is not able to do that. So that's number 2 on my list, and I think arguably that's the biggest concern out of all of them. Now, moving on to number 3, and it's back to the players, and this is kind of something that we've already sort of known about CONCACAF opposition, and it's that players can hurt their stock a lot more than they can help it against CONCACAF opponents. And I would say from the summer, the majority of the squad hurt their stock. And I think it was proven that playing well in MLS doesn't really mean anything at the international level. I think it's necessary to apply context here that CONCACAF and the Gold Cup is the weakest confederation and the weakest confederation-wide tournament that there is in the world, besides Oceania, which doesn't even really count because it's just New Zealand and a bunch of tiny islands with the population that's not even a tenth of the size of some of our states. So that one doesn't even really count. New Zealand just win every tournament by a bunch of goals. If you look at the real ones, Europe, South America, Asia, Africa, and all the tournaments they have, the Euros, Copa America, which we were in and got grouped, AFCON, the Asian Cup, all of these tournaments are more prestigious and harder to play in than the Gold Cup. And again, playing against CONCACAF opponents, there's only so much we can learn from this. I don't really care how good we look against Guatemala. I don't really care how good we look against Trinidad and Tobago. I don't really care how good we look against Haiti, because at the end of the day, these performances do not translate to the higher level, to teams that we will be playing in the World Cup. And we saw that when we played Mexico. We saw that when we played Turkey and Switzerland in the friendlies before the tournament. And we even saw this in the Nations League when we had the full A team, when we lost to Panama, who we'll see if they make the World Cup. They probably will. And we lost to Canada as well. So playing against CONCACAF opponents, you can't really learn much in a positive way, but you can learn a lot in a negative way, like we saw again, bringing back the Nations League example. And like we saw here, players like Patrick Adjumong, who, by the way, isn't even really playing well in MLS. He just got his move to Derby County. We'll be doing a transfer update very soon, so stay tuned for that. It'll have that one, Johnny Cardoso, Malik Tillman, all of the big transfers, so you don't want to miss that one. Those are always some of the favorites that we do over the summer. But I digress. Adjumong wasn't even that good in MLS, and he was still getting all these chances and not playing well. Max Arston is one of the best players, if not the best player, in his position, which is a very unique position because really he's more of a winger than a fullback. And as a fullback, he just clearly didn't work. But like I said, he's one of the best players in his position in MLS and just looked nowhere near the level required in the Gold Cup. Luca de la Torre has been instrumental to San Diego FC's success, huge success. They're top of the West right now in their first season. He's been crucial to that, and he's been looking very good for them so far, but he was invisible in some games. I didn't even know he was on the pitch. He was dragged off early multiple times, and this is despite the fact that we know Poch doesn't like making early subs. He was still dragged off early twice because he wasn't offering anything. Sebastian Berhalter has been huge for Vancouver Whitecaps in their run to the CONCACAF Champions Cup final, where they ultimately lost all their success in MLS, which has kind of plateaued now that him and Brian White missed an extended period of time. Both of them, I mean, for Berhalter, he didn't look good. The only thing that he showed maybe was some set-piece ability, but we have Jack McGlynn for that. He's better at it. He's a better player. There's no need for Berhalter in the roster at all. We saw that this summer. Brian White didn't even really play, and he's the guy who's been probably the best American in the entirety of MLS, of any position. If you look at what he's doing for the Whitecaps, it's pretty impressive. But again, it doesn't translate to the international level. And CONCACAF is the lowest level of the international level. Imagine how bad these guys would be, and we saw some of that in the friendlies, against real opposition from real footballing nations that we could potentially face in 2026. So that's a major concern for me heading into the next year, the rest of this cycle. And overall, I just don't think we took a lot positive away from what I said about Richards and Tillman in terms of the players. Now, for point number 4, it's going to be a broader overall point and a kind of a continuation of what I just mentioned. But it's that Camp Cupcake arguably does more harm than good for the national team. And I think Gold Cup might end up being a similar situation. Now, let's talk about Camp Cupcake first. We've seen this multiple times, and usually it happens when a new manager comes in. Well, obviously, we have every January this Camp Cupcake where all of the MLS players, all the best American MLS players come into camp. It's not an official FIFA window, which means we can't play against actual national teams. We play against other domestic-based teams from very weak nations. I believe it was Costa Rica and Venezuela in this last January. And usually all the players look good because they're playing against really, really poor opposition, players who play in a league that's much worse than MLS. So obviously they look good. Then, as a result of this, the manager sees, okay, all these guys looked really good in January, so let's call them into a main team camp. And then, when they're in the main team camp, they look bad. We saw this in Nations League. We saw this a lot this summer. I mean, how many of the guys from January camp ended up making the Gold Cup roster? I don't have the number off the top of my head, admittedly. Someone, again, let me know in the comments what the number is, but I know it was a huge portion, and I know that a huge portion of this roster came from MLS. And that's why I'm saying that the Gold Cup might be reaching those levels of doing more harm than good. Because for the last 3 Gold Cups now, we haven't brought an A team. We've brought a primarily domestic-based C team of sorts. And again, we just haven't seen a lot positive come from it. And the reason I say that these two things do more harm than good for the national team is, again, because players that look good at these low levels get brought in for higher quality opponents, and then they look bad and they end up hurting the national team. We saw an example of this in the 2022 World Cup, where Jesus Ferreira looked really good at the Gold Cup. He scored a bunch of goals, was terrorizing all the island nations. He became a little bit of a meme because of it, El Pirata. And then he was horrible against the Netherlands in the first half. I think he may have even got pulled at halftime, but in our biggest match in the last who knows how long, because we didn't even qualify for the last World Cup before that, he was horrible. And if we had a better striker up top, if Jesus Ferreira wasn't given this opportunity in Gold Cup to impress and then brought in, maybe it's a different story. So that's just one example. We saw other guys like Helen Acosta, Christian Roldan, Paul Arriola before that. Miles Robinson to this day is still getting call-ups to the national team because he had, one game winner in a Gold Cup final. It's just not an ideal situation for the national team. You have to take everything into perspective. You can only go up against the competition that you have, that you're facing, and any good performances against low-level competition should be taken with a grain of salt. Unfortunately, they haven't been, and it's making the national team arguably worse. Now, the fifth and final point I have kind of brings this full circle. We've talked a lot over the summer and in this video about the guys that were there, the coaching staff that was there. I think the fifth and final point is going to be about the guys that were not there, and it's that for better or for worse, I think there's a lot of conflicting opinions on this. We really need the guys who weren't there, and we need them badly. And for the point, I'll make the counterpoint to this, and it's that they don't have the mentality. We saw this in Copa America, where they got grouped. We saw this in Nations League, where they got fourth place, which is an utter embarrassment in CONCACAF to be getting fourth place as the USA, as the USMNT. I don't think that even needs to be said. I think that's pretty obvious to anyone who pays attention to the sport. But we saw these bad performances, so move on to the next guys up who actually maybe care. The problem is we aren't seeing that great of a mentality from the guys in camp either. They put out good performances against low-level opposition, like I said, and then they decide to speak out against the fans and say, shame on you for not believing in us to make the final, after they just beat Guatemala, actual Guatemala, 2-1 in a very cagey affair that probably could have easily been a draw and gone into penalties, or maybe even a loss. If we didn't get two early goals from Diego Luna, that match looks very different, and maybe we don't even make the final. Also, need I remind you, if Canada don't get a stupid red card at the end of the first half against Guatemala, we're playing them instead in the semifinal, and we saw how that went with our A team. In Nations League, it would have gone even worse with this team, this B or C team that we called up to the Gold Cup. In the semifinal, it would have been a loss. We wouldn't even have gotten to the game against Mexico. So for Tim Ream to be saying shame on the fans for not believing in them after they barely squeaked by Costa Rica on penalties, they barely beat Haiti by 1 goal, they beat Saudi Arabia, who was missing all of their best players because they were all at the Club World Cup with Al Hilal, barely beating them 1-0, and then beating Trinidad and Tobago 5-0. Who cares? It's two islands in the middle of the ocean that don't produce anything. Just because we lost to them a couple of times, which is a complete embarrassment, just because we lost to them a couple of times does not mean that we should celebrate beating them 5-0. That's not how it works. I remember when a USMNT team, I don't remember if it was Camp Cupcake or Gold Cup, beat Trinidad and Tobago. I think it was 7-0 or 7-1. And I think Ferreira scored a hat trick in that game. 5-0 is nothing to celebrate. These other results are nothing to celebrate. And it's nothing to warrant the players saying, shame on you to the fans, believe in us, we're legit, because it's very evident based on the performance this summer that they don't have the mentality required to go up against our biggest rival, Mexico, and even put out a performance that can do the country proud. Diego Luna, I'll use him as an example. There was a lot of hype on him this tournament, especially after the Guatemala game where he scored those 2 goals to end up sending us to the final. And there was a lot of hype on him in the media and playing this up as his huge opportunity because, of course, we know he's Mexican-American. He came out and said that as a kid growing up, he was always watching the USA versus Mexico games, and he was the only one in his family who was actually rooting for the USA. All of the rest of his family, understandably so, was going for Mexico. This was supposed to be his Super Bowl of sorts, and I've mentioned this before, but for a player of Mexican American heritage, playing in this rivalry is the biggest deal imaginable. And he was touted to be our savior this summer. There was even people asking if he should take the number 10 shirt off of Christian Pulisic. Now, in the biggest game of his national team career, he shows up and is probably the worst player on the pitch, absolutely taken out of the game, invisible, ghosted, anything you want to say. He did not show up at all. Every time he did get in on the ball, he created nothing. He had one opportunity with a shot, and he scuffed it very badly. It just overall wasn't good enough. And that's just one example of the players. I mean, I could name the entire squad, but let's be honest, none of you want to hear that. We don't have time for that. At the end of the day, the point is these guys don't have the mentality. The coaching staff, maybe they're trying to build the mentality, but it's going to take a little bit longer than a year because of the 6 or 7 years that Greg Berhalter had instilling this culture where the A-teamers show up, they don't care because their spots are guaranteed. They just goof off in training. They just show up to golf with their friends. As Poch said, they show up to golf, they show up to eat with their friends. That he said that he wouldn't stand for that, and maybe he's not, and that's why he's making comments about no one's guaranteed a spot. He might not even call up the A-teamers like Pulisic, like Musa, like McKennie, like Reyna. He might not even call them up for the next camp, which in principle is good. It's a good mentality to have, but when we saw what we just saw from the Gold Cup roster, and this is the entire point of what I'm saying here, we need those guys back, and it sucks that we kind of have to, I guess, admit defeat to them and say, you know what, guys, we're sorry. We need you more than we realized. Please come back and please help us perform well in the World Cup. I wish it wasn't that, because the mentality that these guys have shown is a disgrace, honestly, to the national team. It's something we've never really seen before, not only from the USMNT, but from any national team all across the world. It's supposed to be the biggest honor for any player, and 99% of the world realizes that for some reason our guys don't. It kind of just is what it is, and we have to deal with it now because the depth that's going to step in and replace them, as we just saw this summer, is not good enough. So those are my 5 biggest takeaways from the summer for the USMNT perspective. If you guys think I'm wrong about any of it, if there's anything that I didn't mention that you think is important to take away heading into the next camp and onward to the World Cup, let me know in the comments. Again, I'm more than happy to interact with you guys, have conversations, have arguments over this national team, because at the end of the day, that's what we're all here for. I'll also be releasing an article on my brand new Substack. I'll have a link to that in the description of this video, going over every single player that was in the roster this Gold Cup and looking at where their stock stands for the national team heading into the next year, where they're looking at for a potential World Cup roster spot. We'll also have a video later this summer. Hopefully it'll be both me and Yuri in that, predicting our 2026 World Cup rosters. We did that last summer. It'll be very interesting to see how much it's changed from last summer to this summer. And of course, it's still going to change because we still have one more year. But that's just a quick preview of what's coming for the rest of the summer. Stay tuned for all of that. Stay tuned for the transfer updates, which will be coming very soon. Let me know as well if there's any other kind of content you want to make. Since all the USMNT games are done and it's a little bit until the next season starts, there's a bit of an opening content-wise. So if there's anything outside of the box that you want to see from us, let us know, and we'll be happy to oblige. But for now, please like the video if you enjoyed. It does so much to help the channel. Subscribe if you're new. Again, helps us pushing. We just hit 2,000. We're trying to make a push towards 3,000. So subscribe if you're new to the channel. If this is the first video you've watched, welcome. I hope you're back next time. Have a good day. And here's hoping the USMNT can improve for next camp.